How are we doing, everybody? I'm joined with George today, and the emphasis is going to be very much on getting rid of a hip extension and focusing on rotation, right? You guys are absolutely free to do this as well, but this video has been prompted because a lot of people send in their swings to my social media channels, which is in the description below. It's absolutely free to do so. Happy to give you some tips to give you an idea as to what you should work on. And what happened was the video that I put out last night was that it was unanimous how many people struggle with an early hip extension, which means the pelvis is moving closer to the ball. Now, that's what this whole premise of this video is going to be about. It's going to be about how do you get rid of a early hip extension, and the answer in its simplicity is a lack of rotation. And the fix is arguably very simple as well, but I think the thing that stops people is the lack of understanding to maybe the sequence of the swing. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and George is going to be kindly demonstrating. So George, you swing up to the top and pause for me then. Okay, so here's the conundrum that a lot of amateur golfers face, is that, and we'll talk about this in more detail as I have already done, but again, keep reiterating some of these points with different feelings, is that how the right shoulder and the right elbow should work in the golf swing. So the biggest problem with most amateur golfers is that the right shoulder, if you like, comes over, right? Which is, yeah, like an exaggeration of George there. So that basically means that you end up swinging over the top, which is problematic because, take it back to the parallel position, that's fine. Now you can see the way the shaft is, in theory, above plane. Now what we mean is that the shaft angle should be pointing down on towards the target line to, in theory, be on plane. So if you swing back up to the top and pause, so in theory, what should happen, right, is that if you trigger the correct rotation again, which means that George is kind of rotating his upper body towards the left, right? His left shoulder is moving round towards his left ankle. His left hip bone is rotating at the same rate, but it's working back and behind him. So all of his weight at this point is in the left heel. Now, one of the things that's going to stop you from swinging over the top, if you like, or in theory not on plane, is you have to understand the functionality of the right elbow. Now again, we're not going to go into massive detail of that today, but I think one of the problems is, swing up to the top again and pause, is that, and if you show us that over the top move again, if this is a common move, then sometimes people try and hide behind it, right? And that's what I saw again on the video, is some golfers will swing flatter. So if you show me a really flat arm plane, let the elbow fold more up, right? A lot of golfers are in this sort of position because even with an over the top moves, do it slowly, yeah, it still looks more on plane. But again, it's still the same sort of problem that you're not going to be able to move correctly from that sort of position, right? So it's important that you understand the rotation has to exist, okay? To stop an early hip extension, in a nutshell, is a lack of rotational movement. And all you've got to do is move around towards that left-hand side. Now, what we'll start to talk about, and I've mentioned it on the channel before, is we'll start to talk more about the functionality of the right elbow. And if you swing up to the top again and pause, and whether you choose to be more right side dominant and let the elbow push more in front, okay, or which would arguably create more of a shallowing motion of the shaft, and we see this with some golfers, or whether you allow the right elbow to fall more to the side and the shaft gets a little bit more vertical. We'll talk about that in more detail. But the point is that right elbow has to function in that sort of manner, because otherwise you're going to swing over the top. And that's the thing, right? You shouldn't be trying to protect your over the top by compensating in any other way. The rotation has to exist, and you have to get rid of that early hip extension. And the way you're going to know that you can do this is that if you, George, swing up to the top one more time for us, is that when you video your swings, right, you draw a line similar to what I did on the channel last night. You can draw a line on the base of your hips, and then in theory, as long as you rotate correctly, so if you start to turn, the hip should still be in contact with the chair, but if you, or with the line I should say, but if you swing up to the top again and pause, let's say you try to focus on the right elbow move solely now, right, and this is what starts to happen, okay? So a lot of golfers are trying to emulate this sort of position here with the upper body, but it's never going to really work because the pelvis is moving too close. So you have to go back to working on the rotational aspect. Now, if that means that you struggle and you feel like you swing over the top, then it's not because you're over rotating, right? It's not because of that. It's because you can't function the right elbow correctly. That's kind of what this video has to be about. It's like a lot of golfers are kind of okay going back. Maybe a few were lacking a bit of rotation, to be fair, but generally speaking, okay. But then quite a few people are moving this way. So it's subtle, but my weight's moving more forward. right? And then all of a sudden it's very difficult to create a rotation, which is then when you get an early release or some sort of compensation in the swing. So it's important that you understand, as George demonstrated, that you're trying to trigger a rotation. You're trying to get more pressure in towards this left-hand side. Now, questions that I've had on the channel, okay, and I am going to be documenting more and more of this stuff on the channel all the time in more detail, would be what triggers the movement, okay? Can a right elbow trigger rotational movement? It can as a feeling, right? You could feel like as you're skimming a stone, you throw the right elbow in front of the right hip, you could argue would trigger a rotation. You know, you would still need to rotate the upper and the lower body, and I would probably suggest that maybe it works more in sync with the others, but it can still be a feeling that could change somebody's approach towards the golf swing. The other question that I get a lot would be about the left shoulder, right? So if you swing up to the top again and pause, if you start coming down very slowly, you know, should the left shoulder work up? Should it work down? Well, to be honest, it depends on the right elbow functionality, probably more so than anything else. So if somebody drifts the right elbow more forward, the left shoulder would have more of an appearance of being more tilted up. If you're more of a dragger where you drag the club down a little bit more, then you'd probably get the appearance that the shoulders are going to be less tilted. I think what's really important is that, as I keep putting content out on the channel, is that you've got to make a decision on what it is that you're trying to do. Right now, I would probably suggest that most people, if they're watching this content, are trying to obviously improve their swing, but I would probably guess they're trying to hit the ball better, further, and arguably straighter. Well, you're going to get more distance if you focus back on your rotation. And more importantly, the reason why you've watched this video is because you're trying to get rid of a hip extension. Well, like I say, to kind of conclude, that you're going to get rid of your hip extension by working on the upper body rotation moving in towards that left-hand side, right? That's really key. The way that you stop then, in theory, swinging over the top is by understanding how the right elbow would work closer towards the right hip. And again, how much the elbow works would be, I would suggest, a preference. As long as the shaft angle is operating on plane, then you've got a golf swing which can work. So the point is finally that, you know, why do we create the early hip extension? It's a lack of rotational movement, right? So let's say you next go down the driving range and you start to notice that you're turning much better, but you're starting to hit the ball towards the left-hand side. Well, you know, that's where you need to be careful that you don't just kind of immediately go back to trying to create some sort of thing to help you get back on plane, right? I would ingrain this for a little bit first and get back in towards this rotational movement. And then from there, then you can start to work on the right elbow, working more towards the right hip, but it has to work in relationship to the rotation. What I'll start to talk about on the channel in more detail is, you know, why would we create such a shallowing? Why would the shaft angle look more vertical? The purpose of how to get the club face square earlier in the golf swing. So we'll start to talk about those details in more over the upcoming weeks. But to get rid of a hip extension, you have to work on a rotation. And as you know, George demonstrated myself, I think the reason why most people are fearful of doing this is because they don't like the concept of swinging over the top. But what you've got to understand is that the rotation isn't forcing you to swing over the top. That would be your functionality of your right hand side.